So Laura, Peters, and I are going to be co-presenting today. We're both from Oregon State University. We're both in the same program, geography and geospatial science. Just a bit of background on me before I hand over to Laura. My training, my education is engineering and environmental science. So I've been working with BAM for the last 2.5 months and have another month to go, but that'll be remote back in Oregon. Working on satellite analyses of detecting urban damage, infrastructural damage over many, many years or at a global scale. And so I've been working with conflict from a very applied side, working with second half of this presentation on conflict data sets. Have dealt a little bit with just conceptualization of conflict, but a lot of the work that's being motivated is trying to account for some of the limitations that we'll be talking about at the end of the presentation, which is existing data sets and just like, in a sense that they're not quite relevant or the most useful data for some of the questions that we're asking in academic fields associated with conflict and environmental change and also food security. So I'm coming at this, and I'll be talking mainly about the second half of this. Laura, whatever background, has much more on the front side on conflict theory side of things.
My name is Laura Peters. I'm a PhD student at Oregon State University in geography. And my background is more in peace and conflict studies, as well as international development. And right now, a lot of the projects I'm working on relate to natural hazard-related disasters and conflict and violence, and the complex interplay between these two factors. So, should I?
Yeah, without further ado,
Right.
I guess we should say the presentation today is going to be a little bit split. We'll have some sort of group open discussion, and then a few more like lecture style slides, but we're going to start with an activity.
Yeah. So we thought it would be a good idea to start today off with really going into the foundations of what we're actually talking about when we talk about conflict and violence, and also when we talk about peace, because there's a really wide variance of how people understand these terms. So what we'd like you to do is perhaps just take a couple minutes and really think about, we're going to try to put together a working definition of both conflict and peace. So if you can just jot down perhaps in your notes or just in your mind, just what is conflict and what is peace? And then we will pull together a working definition drawing from your ideas.
So we'll just think 2 or 3 minutes maybe, and we'll come back together.
No pressure. This is going to be our definition. Okay, so when all of you are thinking about what is conflict, we'll start with that and try to put together some ideas about what is conflict from your perspectives. Does anyone have anything they'd like to throw up?
Damage to life and livelihoods through violence. So, through violence.
Disruption to the rule of law. Disagreement between populations.
So maybe it's not like an instant, but it drags for some time.
It's like
Goes on for some span of time.
protracted or gradual what, disagreement or?
Yeah.
I just had a question. I mean, conflict in a general sense, not necessarily armed conflict, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe,
No, but I mean, okay, I'm always conflicted. I know, because so I'm a lawyer, and so in international law we have a very different definition to what conflict is than what I actually apply in my work here, which can range from civil unrest and political tensions and electoral violence all the way to full-scale armed conflict between countries and between electoral
Yeah.
violence. But then when you have like a legal definition for it, it's very specific to anyone who picks up arms. So it's more limited in the sense. But all these definitions are conflict that can simply be tensions between populations, even if it doesn't lead to any form of violence. I don't know if I'm entirely convinced that that would be called conflict.
Maybe you can note that there's a difference between legal and maybe practical definitions,
Yeah.
or how it's conceptualized.
And the example I can think of is, for example, Lebanon. They're not in a conflict as a country, but there are a number of tensions between the different sects, sectarian, and it's not even violence, it's just tension in the government, in the parliament, in the population at large, but it's not conflict. So I'm not really sure.
All right, so we have, is there anything else anyone wanted to add to the working definition of conflict before we move on to peace?
Permitted a displacement, but it's kind of an outcome. Necessarily characteristic.
See. This is great. Yeah, this is really good discussion. So moving on to peace. What ideas do we have about how would you define peace?
I'd say it's an absence of violence in all forms, and that you can resolve a conflict without violence. Then you have your, positive and negative peace. Negative being when you have a ceasefire, it's peace, but may not be that constructive. You have positive peace, that space gets filled with reconciliation and maybe also democratization, however you define it to that extent.
That foreshadows.
Sorry, no.
It's
It's not, no, because not necessarily democratization. It could be socialization. Democracy is not everything.
Thanks for reminding me.
Sorry, we had this discussion before, so.
Any other ideas about how we would conceptualize peace and what we think about when we think about peace?
Stability in all areas of life.
Kind of brings stability.
To me, it's more even bigger than that. It's a freedom from fear of all of the above kind of thing.
Freedom from fear of conflict.
Yeah, of freedom of fear of prosecution, of
Violence.
disagreements.
Persecution.
Yeah. Yeah. It's,
Yeah, persecution. Right. Maybe also sustainable working relationship, whether it's with countries or individuals.
Is there anything else anyone wanted to add to our ideas about peace before we move on?
I don't, for me, it's like the ability to have tensions without a breaking point or something. Yeah, because I mean, even if you think of a peace context, there's lots of tensions happening, lots of different interests or ability to have groups with different interests without them coming to a breaking point of no solution.
It would lead
something
to
like that.
conflict. The breaking point is.
Yes.
Agreeing to disagree.
Helpful for us to understand as well. Next slide, please. So,
Sorry.
But can I say something about that? And I
Yes.
think it goes back to Francesca's point as well, which is, I think what you said at the end just now was this kind of overlap between what some would see as conflict and others would see it as peace. And at least in my work, we don't need to compartmentalize them that way. You
can you
know?
elaborate?
It doesn't matter if you're in a situation of peace or in a situation of conflict. You can have them coexist on certain things. So you can have economic peace where the two countries are trading with each other and investing in each other's whatever economies. But then you have them fighting a proxy war elsewhere. And so you don't necessarily have to deconstruct them to understand the reality of what's happening on the ground.
Right.
Because sometimes when you try to do that, it's like, okay, are these two countries allies? That question we get a lot. And it's like, that's not the point.
Be counterproductive to try to categorize something as a conflict situation or a peaceful situation or a cooperative situation, and that a relationship is very multifaceted, and so you can have cooperation in certain areas and conflict in others.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's not useful, it is, but for certain contexts, right? In WFP, if you say, oh, but you know, this is a peaceful country. Are there hungry people? It doesn't matter what the result, the reason behind it is, conflict or peace. That's what we go to, no?
Right.
So, but for advocacy purposes or for legal purposes, it's important to define it. But if you're asking, I mean, about WFP, at least that's my perspective. Naming them, unless it's at strategic level, practically,
Whether it's peaceful or conflictive, we may see that, but most of the time, I would say that in the areas in which you operate, you wouldn't see that type of stability necessarily. For the purposes of how we are conceptualizing these terms, I wanted to just say that conflict, as we see it, is a natural, inevitable, and often positive part of development and other change processes. So conflict itself, and other change processes. So conflict itself is not necessarily violent. Conflict can be a very constructive, positive part of our daily life is filled with conflict. Relationships inherently are filled with conflict. And it's how we manage that conflict, how we deal with it, that can result in very negative, destructive processes associated with violence, or positive change-making processes that can lead to achieving sustainable development goals, to achieving positive changes for people in the context where we operate. And so with understanding that, I wanted to then to talk about, and I'm sure that some of you are familiar with some of these concepts. Maybe everyone is familiar with these concepts. But I wanted to talk about direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence very briefly. Because again, when we're talking about conflict, that's actually a very neutral, just sort of fact of life almost. And then we can manage this conflict through different forms of violence or peace in peaceful ways. But direct violence is the type of violence that we often think about when we think about conflict or violence or war. It's someone is beaten or tortured or raped, or there's something that we can see and something that we can measure, and therefore something that we can more easily combat as well and address in the work that we do. But underlying this direct violence, that is like a very common way of thinking about violence, is also structural violence and cultural violence. And I apologize that there are a lot of words on the screen, but in case some people haven't come across these concepts yet, I just wanted to make sure that the words are on the screen for you. But structural violence, really quickly, refers to the social structures or institutions that harm people by preventing them from meeting their basic needs, such as survival, welfare, identity, and freedom. And I think that I heard some mentions of this in our initial conversation about what is conflict and what is peace. So some examples of structural violence can include poverty, when there's a great inequality between people who have what they need and people who don't have what they need. It's these preventable types of things that prevent people from achieving their full potential or capacity. So we also have corruption, lack of access to food, education, healthcare, these types of things. And then cultural violence can be understood as the aspects of culture that can be used to justify or legitimize direct or structural violence. And this can occur in religion and ideology, language and art, empirical and formal science, and even law. So cultural violence makes direct and structural violence look or feel right, or at least not wrong. And so some examples of this can be myths or legends, the normalization of violence in certain circumstances or enacted by certain people. So the death penalty, for example, is a way that in some countries, in some contexts, people think that this is a normal, okay thing because it is legitimized by law, it's enacted in a very specific circumstance, so it's okay. And other people would say, no, that's not okay. And then there's also the belief that certain individuals or groups deserve what they get. So there are some groups or people who believe that, for example, the homeless, that they haven't worked hard enough and so they don't deserve housing. Or other ideas that are used to justify why there is structural violence that exists and also why there may be direct violence that exists. And so some of you also are probably familiar with the Norwegian sociologist Johan Galtung, who is oftentimes seen as the father of peace studies. This is sort of a famous image. He conceptualized a lot of the direct violence, structural violence, cultural violence. And above this line is what we see as visible, so it's just more obvious to see forms of direct violence, but then also reinforcing this direct violence and underneath the surface are different forms of structural and cultural violence. And these basically exist in all societies. They're not specific to a place that we consider as conflict place. And then we were mentioning earlier, I wanted to very briefly touch on this as well, the idea of positive peace versus negative peace. So when we were talking about peace, there are certain forms of peace that we would characterize as negative peace, which is understood as the absence of violence or fear of violence. So negative peace would maybe be a ceasefire. It would be measured by, if violence is measured in direct terms, such as how many casualties there are, negative peace would be seeking to reduce that number. Whereas positive peace is this kind of larger picture of what we look at, and it's the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. And I don't recall exactly what was on the slide when we were coming up with the working definition, but I know that there were a number of things that you all said that relate to positive peace. So this is sort of positive peace is addressing the structural and cultural forms of violence as well. So as a second activity, I wanted to really quickly, if you could just make groups of 2 or 3 or 4, whatever suits you, and to talk a little bit amongst yourselves about what factors related to this conversation or not, it doesn't have to be specific to conflict, peace, violence, what factors undermine food security in the context where you work. We'll just have a couple minutes, and then we can talk about that briefly before moving to the next session.
Okay, go. I don't want to. How about this?
You always go to Saturday, I can double the right?
Yeah, no, it's,
Since in a lot of the countries where we population ability to move So move from their base to their farms, or to their market. So restriction of movement
Yeah.
is, I think, one great factor that impacts laws.
I mean, I could just list everything that's wrong.
Yeah, conflict.
Oh Lord, no,
Yeah, so where there are inequalities, so the whole governance.
Resources distribution in the country.
Yeah.
Also education.
Yeah.
that's part of conflict. When we're this large, how do you separate?
And I don't know to what extent also kind of knowledge, education, knowledge
Not just
get them how to operate.
Say natural, like also the city.
Having access to best
Resources,
Try to wrap up in the next
advice.
minute or so.
as in water, fuels, energy, like the dam that they were.
Advice and everything.
Yeah.
Production units done.
Yes.
And yeah, just having access to information, like is it going to rain?
Oh, why
now,
not? I copied them. I haven't.
or should I wait?
Perfect. Okay. Restriction based on government. Advice and information.
Yeah, so,
Basic needs, your basic need in life.
there are cultural things that we do, like one gender
It's always kind of a lower level.
the other
There might be inequality with community or something, or lack of knowledge, or there's high level.
Sounds like there's some really good discussions, and I feel so sad to be interrupting them. But if we could bring it back and maybe open up the conversation so that we can share amongst ourselves. So what kind of things have you all been talking about? So what factors, conflict or otherwise, undermine food security?
Restriction of movement, so not only for the household itself, but also from, let's say, traders to bring goods to the market. But yeah, restriction of movement. Yeah.
Maybe picking up on the types of conflict you described, two of them, structural and cultural, might be more linked to chronic food security, in a way, because they kind of keep communities marginalized and kind of at low level in tribals and food security, whereas the more evident violent conflict then that would cause food insecurity situations. You might have spikes because of persistent movement or lack of capacity, institutional level. It's kind of the chronic and acute insecurity is kind of a fundamental distinction.
Yeah, perhaps along the, from what you're saying, you picture seeing the visible forms of violence and the more invisible forms of violence, or kind of pushing along this chronic.
May link think was kind of completed, but I think those two would link more to chronic food security, whereas the other one would link more to acute food security. That kind of requires a few responses and interventions from agencies.
We talked about natural hazards, and especially cyclical ones that could aggravate conflict as well between, what were you saying, pastoralists?
Yeah, farmers, for example, in seasons.
And then we also talked about resources, like lack of resources, water, fuel, etc. That could cause a number of things, one of which are conflict, but also ability, like the lack of ability to produce, basically, inability to produce food. So another point was access and availability. And then, of course, weak institutions within a country that don't, for example, manage these resources well, or they don't distribute the wealth of the nation across the country. And then also drugs and crime.
Is there anything else anyone would like to add to that discussion?
Yeah, we just want to add poverty and limited access to the market, and lack of stability, a lack of infrastructure even.
When you say infrastructure, do you mean physical infrastructure, like
Yeah.
roads and?
Yeah. And also demographic problems and in general climate change and environmental risks.
We discussed about, in summary, something we discussed, but any basic need, and if it's in livelihood, if you have crisis on insecurity, that could be climate disaster, natural disaster, or could be conflict or man-made, that they make conflict, or that could be food security crisis. So the basic human needs, that is most very efficient medical access to the other cities.
Is there anything else anyone would like to add quick before we keep moving? Okay. I know that there was a lot of excellent discussion, so I'm glad that everyone's had a chance to think about some of these topics. And just advance to the next slide really quick and we can pop back. I wanted to point out that, as I suspected, a lot of the things that are impacting food security, food insecurity, are related to what we call the pillars of positive peace. So I don't know if you can see the text. Some of these are well-functioning government, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, good relations with neighbors, high levels of human capital, acceptance of the rights of others, and low levels of corruption, sound business environment. So it's just this really, it encourages a very broad view of what it is that what kinds of conditions we're working with, and what we're actually between positive and negative view. But even that as a concept emerged quite recently, in the mid-1990s, with Johan Galton's work on positive peace. And it's really revolutionary in the sense that it allows us to look at the conditions, the very broad range of conditions that exist in a place, and those conditions are very dynamic. They're always changing, and they're filtering into these larger processes that are at play. And in the work that you do, it also allows you, if you have this broad, expansive view of what peace is and what conflict and violence are, it allows us to go into places and not only to address something very specific, like direct violence, but also to look at very vulnerable places. Vulnerability is underpinned by a lot of these types of conditions that we're talking about that relate to structural and cultural violence. And so it allows us to look in these places of especially high vulnerability and to start to transform these factors or to at least understand how we can grapple with them and be effective in the work that we do. So now that we brought out the view really large to see what we think about when we think about these conceptualizations, Jamon will help to focus us back in on what databases have to offer when we think about conflict.
Thanks.
Jamon.
So who has worked with systematically collected conflict data sets of one form or another? A couple of people. So those of you who have, what data sets or databases did you work with?
Acklid.
Acklid? Acklid as well.
But also, I'm hearing that DPA and I guess WFP as well. Maybe it's you guys that I heard about this from, but working on a database that picks up on particular terminologies in different news sources or analytical pieces and bringing them together to kind of map out a trend of, you know, how many times this, I mean, it's an algorithm or something that measures how many times this is mentioned in what context, and it can predict it or does forward-looking analysis for that trend to see if conflict might happen or something. Is that you guys? No?
Yeah, no, it's. I
Well,
don't know whom to.
No, security is doing.
Yeah,
security.
Security.
Okay. But DPA is also working on this, Department of Political Affairs. But it's like in the pilot phase, and it's something we're trying to.
And it's another modeling framework in a sense, then anticipatory or predictive modeling.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, yeah, Active is more of a database, but this one should have a database component as
Sure,
well.
it's built on a database.
Exactly.
Good. So Acklid, as people have mentioned, is one of the main. Difficult to say if it's the leading conflict database. I would guess it is in terms of its use across different sectors. I'll be talking about it in a little bit more detail, but so we've talked about cultural, structural, and direct violence. Conflict as it's conceptualized in databases, there are at least 30 global databases on conflict. Just like a quick assessment, there have been a variety of comparative efforts between these different databases. This is just a snapshot of a very long list. Acklid happens to be at the top of this list alphabetically, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Database, or dataset. But there are a variety of other projects throughout. This is another quite well-known project called the Correlates of War Project, which, as you can see, is very historical, territorial change going back to 1816, colonial dependency contiguity. So this is very historical. And as you'd expect, this is not giving you latitude, longitudes of boundaries of territorial change, right? This is high-level change. And Acklid, on the other side of the coin, is very new, it is continuous, it's very granular spatially, temporally, and thematically. So suffice it to say there's not a single best fit conflict database for the variety of questions and challenges to food security that Laura worked us through. But if we just talk about Acklid, I chose Acklid because, as was evident, it's quite commonly used. It's been collecting data for about 30 years now. In some, it is a database, it's a Excel or CSV spreadsheet. Collects, the project itself collects, analyzes, and maps subnational georeference data on conflict events. Now, this is something that's probably taken for granted now that we can work with latitude, longitude at a specific date and have all this other thematic information. But this is new. This is only the last 15, 20 years that we've been doing this, and that these databases have been consistently, systematically collected country to country, year to year with a standardized methodology. That makes it incredibly valuable for doing these cross comparisons over time, over groups, over countries. This is a new thing, but it just looks, take it for granted how much detail there is, right? Just like you were talking about with the sort of data mining effort, looking at news reports, that's basically what Acklid does. It's a team of 3 or 4 dozen people that work with some automatic algorithms, but it's a lot of interpersonal human communications, sourcing local and national news reports, They also bring in various NGO reports from data collected in the field in especially difficult to reach or otherwise data poor regions. So this is in no way a web crawler that just finds data and then pulls out the date, pulls out the people involved or the groups involved, pulls out the number of casualties from a report. This is very curated. It's a high quality, high level of quality, and that's one of the reasons, these are all the reasons why it's so commonly used. It's much more confidence in this data. So what does conflict look like in one of these modern conflict event databases like ACLID? Well, ACLID, this is from their methodology, does not redefine what a conflict is. So all for naught, right? Those decisions are left to the user. Another quote from the methodology, ACLID allows users to select on the type of event, the type of actor, the type of interaction, the named actors, and the location or time period. Of those, the type of actor is critical, right? A specific extremist group, a specific group that's being attacked. The location or time period would be another. We could select by a country, select by any administrative region, or simply say find all conflict in 2016. Those are probably the fastest ways to sort of cut through the data. But however you want to filter it, you end up with this data set that has a consistent series of, there's several dozen fields in an ACLID data set that have a consistent atomic unit, so to speak, that includes the date, location, actors or agents, and the event types. And critically, going back to our definition of conflict, which does not require direct violence, neither does ACLID. It doesn't matter if there are any fatalities or if there's any physical harm involved at all. It will still be brought into ACLID. But so then the question is, well, what does this really mean to have, like what is relevant or appropriate to be brought into ACLID? And we'll talk about that in the next slide. But this flexibility and really this granularity, this preservation of these details means that it can be customized in any way that's appropriate for the user. It's a lot of weight on the user's shoulders to know how to select these data, to know what kind of data is appropriate for a given question or analysis. So,
sorry, Jamon,
yes.
so what is the source of ACLID data then? Where does it?
They refer to it as human sourced. So it's people on the ground. It's mainly journalists.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
in the field reports. It's a lot of published stories as well. Sometimes there's like national newspapers, but it's usually very local reports. In ACLID, there's a field, the very last field, which is called the notes field, and that will be some strip of text that gives a qualitative description of what happened. So when you look at the actual database, there's date and actors and location, all that, but then you have this notes field, and that usually is verbatim taken from a news report, and it will say so many people threw grenades into a market at this town at this time of day, killing so many number of people, and that's abstracted from a news report typically. So if ACLID doesn't define what conflict means, what do they bring in as conflict? Well, they work with a slightly different sort of take on what's relevant, and they use the term political disorder. So this is one of the terms we brought up in the first activity. Disorder, right? Lack of stability and incongruity with what's expected. What kinds of things result in political disorder? Well, battles, violence against civilians, remote violence, riots, and protests. And you can see the split right here. Battles, violence against civilians, and remote violence, those are typically going to be examples of direct violence. The last two here, riots, of course, could be a violent demonstration, but usually not. And then protests also could become violent. If they do, those are considered a riot. And then those would generally be just nonviolent demonstrations and typically around some sort of political factor, social or political factor. So these are the 5 types of events that make up what ACLID thinks could be considered or could be relevant for a conflict event. As I mentioned, these are collected globally and often daily. Here's the total aggregate view of the number of events split into those, I guess they've merged rights and protests, so those 4 categories. And you can see, Syria, quite high, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Somalia, right, Yemen, places that we're all familiar with. We also have temporal views. ACLED does have a field of whether it involved a fatality, at least one fatality or not. So we can look at the fatalities view, but we can also just look at the events timeline, and we see basically this massive spike from 2010 going forward in the riots and protests category. That is almost certainly a result of different reporting, not just that there's all of a sudden a ton of riots and protests in 2010. Remote violence, of course, that has increased, especially under drone war and often more militarized. Remote access, militarized actions in remote areas. Battles and violence against civilians has also increased. Some of that is going to be increased reporting. These are not just focused on things like the Syrian civil war or internationalized war, but these can be very local, interpersonal, or even 2 extremist groups fighting at the fringe of their territories, right? So these are things that typically would not have been reported in previous decades, but now we have more exposure to these data sets. And this general trend that we see here since 2010, we see a little bit of that mirrored in the fatalities timeline as well, but it's quite reduced. There's still this general increase associated with increased reporting. Overall, we have battles and remote violence contributing most, as you'd expect, fatalities. So this is the global view from ACLED. This is going back to 1998. What can we do with that in terms of an operational context? These are 2 graphics from an OECD report that I contributed last year, looking at violent conflict events in Borno State as it relates to locations of food markets. So we have on the right just the geographic distribution of markets in northeastern Nigeria. That's from FuseNet, which is another data set that is not a conflict data set, but is certainly related, and it's also georeferenced and has good temporal information. So with the granularity that ACLED has, we can readily overlay the timeline of Boko Haram conflict events and fatalities with the periods of market monitoring, basically. So the data, the time periods in which we know how markets are changing their operational status, we can immediately find these time periods of interest for Boko Haram, their attacks in the area. And then we can map on to our distribution of FuseNet markets, which are the green dots in the background, to fatal Boko Haram attacks, and then specifically filter down into attacks that we know took place in a market or at the edge of a market. Getting to this level of did it take place in a market is not a spatial query. That's not looking at how latitude longitudes are within, say, a 100th of a degree from a known market location. This is purely from the textual, that description field, the notes field. This is where this, whether or not it affected a market came from. So ACLED is so reliable because of the geospatial and temporal information, but there's a good bit of qualitative data that can be pulled out just from the journalist descriptions as well. Linking this to try to understand some of the timing of these attacks. The colors are a little bit skewed here, but those of you who work with remote sensing data, the green bar shows the typical agricultural phenology in the area. So when we see a peak in this green curve, this is right at the harvest period, as you can see it here. This is when crops would typically be harvested in Borno. And we can overlay the temporality of Boko Haram attacks against that same plot. And you start seeing this trend where Boko Haram is not attacking right during the harvest. Why would they attack during the harvest? Because they're dependent upon these people, the farmers, harvesting their crops, right? But right after the harvest is done, that's when an attack may occur. So this is looting. Later on, as we get towards the end of the harvest, when everything has been harvested and the reserves are full, that's again when we see a peak in attacks. And then later, this is of course looking at an annual timeline on month by month. In the lean season, right before the harvest, that's also when we see attacks. So when the resources have been depleted, when there's an abundance of resources available to loot, we see a timing of Boko Haram attacks, right? That comes out of just the temporality. Yes?
There seems to be some interesting trend just before you get to harvesting, actually. I think it's the point when the curve for the crop is going up. I suppose that's right from planting. And then you also see the curve for attacks is going up. So then the interpretation towards the end becomes a bit complicated because you don't have anything to harvest anyway.
Right, here you.
Yes.
Yeah. One explanation is just that is the leanness part of the year. And so when Boko Haram resources have been depleted the most, nothing so much to do with the next harvest, but the fact that it's been so long since the last harvest that the attacks would be coming for looting the resources. But this is also merging all crops. This is merging all these different agricultural calendars. So there could be other trends in here that are sort of that we're missing because we're looking at it in aggregate.
And
Yeah.
then during the rainy season, also you have to consider the problems that some rainfall can break some roads or something like that, so the accessibility of the different places is a bit weaker.
Yeah.
And then there are also the fact that most of the people are, as you say, engaged in some peaceful and growing activities. So this can be also something that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
What can be interested to see if this is an area where they have temporary migration during the period, the lean period, exactly before the lean period. I'm quite surprised to see the lower in May. The lower level of attack in May, that is really the start of the lean period. Then you have the peak, but it's quite surprising to see this.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about the accessibility of attacks as well.
Yeah.
That's a good point. And we, as another example, we just submitted a paper looking at violence around or very close to refugee camps. Also using ACLA data, so we looked across, just focused on African refugee camps managed by UNHCR. So we can do, plotting the geographic distribution of camps since 2000, look at the number of ACLA events, and then we can also look at non-refugee settlements in this data set called GRUMP, a Global Rural Urban Mapping Project. Totally different distributions, of course, and we're interested in where is there a high concentration of refugee camps and a high concentration of ACLA attacks. And we charted the proximity of conflict events to refugee camps. We also looked at the years that refugee camps were established and how just generally ACLA conflict events increased during that same timeline. So just sort of looking at a temporal comparison and then also looking at a spatial comparison. And we see that there's actually quite an abundance of ACLA events very, very close, within 10 kilometers to refugee camps. About 40% of ACLA events during this period took place within 10 kilometers of refugee camps. But again, another limitation of these data is we don't know the targeting, we don't know the intended, we don't know if camps were specifically targeted or if this just happens to be sort of co-location, right? So this is a correlation, not in any way a sort of a causation that there's a refugee camp there and therefore we see an attack. Those data, we don't have that kind of thematic information. So we still have this problem. There's an abundance of data, right? But extracting the appropriate kind of information that we can actually make defensible claims on is still the challenge. We still need a high level of contextual understanding.
Did you in any way do the same kind of distance to particular locations where farmers are to overlap with what is the season? Because looking at the previous graph, I mean, there's so many factors that would
Sure.
lead to this in
Sure.
in Boko Haram's attack. And yeah, some of them might be related to the leaf season, but easily, even if it's the harvest season in the winter, in any case, in most countries in the winter, although, you know, it doesn't get too cold there, but the attacks decrease, so it might not have anything
Yeah.
to do with the harvest season.
It's kind of a
So-
fighting season as well.
Yeah. So maybe if you overlay the distance to the plantations or something, or the markets where these flowers are from, with the spikes.
Yeah, that's good.
I don't know, maybe we've already done that.
No, we haven't done that. We haven't looked at regions of production.
Exactly.
There's a separate paper that, or project that's funded by the World Bank, which is not going quite that far, but at least trying to get a lock onto different seasons of production. This area in northeastern Nigeria, Borno specifically, or just Lake Chad in general, we tried to generate good high-resolution agricultural extent maps of that area for like 3 years, and just never, it's really, really difficult area to systematically map. So this new effort, it actually has done that quite well. So with those data, that's a good idea. You could actually look at not just the points of access, but the points of distribution as well. Yeah, that's a good idea.
You can quote me on it.
One more example, just thinking about how these data can be used. This is a subtly, not subtly, it's a totally different data set. UCDP, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, and GED stands for Georeferenced Event Data Set. Really similar to ACLID, different kinds of attributes, but georeferenced dates, they have different criteria for inclusion. I'm going to sit down because this is a couple of slides together. So if we look at Syria with UCDP GED data, this is our distribution. This is a proportional dot map, so we have larger symbols where there's more conflict events recorded by UCDP GED. Let's zoom into the Aleppo governorate here. Now let's look at a different take on conflict, which is the Carter Center Territorial Control Data Set.
That's what we use as well.
Oh, good. Completely different view of where conflict is. Slightly different years. This is 2014 to 2017, but you can see a very, very different distribution. That's scaled by the number of changes in territorial control at a given location. Now let's zoom into Aleppo city. Same data set we were just looking at. Now this is really fascinating because this is sub-settlement changes in territorial control, right? This isn't just number of changes in Aleppo. This is specific neighborhoods within Aleppo. So it's very granular.
Circles are the number of times that control has changed for that particular area.
Yeah, they're scaled by that number.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And then if we look at a different view, let's look at UNOSAT conflict infrastructural damage maps. Again, different timeline, 2013 to 2016. But you can see there's just radically different distributions, right? Totally different views on like where is the conflict, where is the war happening. Some of this, whereas this is fairly, you can't say unbiased, but it's not so much, you of course are dependent on information coming out, and so areas that are consistently bombarded, well, you're not going to get information there, right? But if we look at the infrastructure damage maps, this is purely a function of the morphology of the urban area. These really densely packed together structures show much more damage. They're in a sense, a better, more effective medium for recording the damage than large open fields, right? So there's where you have much more infrastructure, you're going to have much more higher likelihood, not of an attack, but of detection of that attack. So this is a function that there's a bias here. But you probably all know these UNOSAT data. This is one of the most used conflict data sets from a satellite imagery derived data set. Limitation of that UNOSAT data, well, they've only done it for 5 cities. All of Syria, 5 cities. We compare these 3 data sets, we just see completely different views. UCDP versus Carter Center versus UNOSAT, different temporal, different spatial levels of granularity. And this means when you work with these different kinds of data sets that you have trade-offs, which we've been talking about the entire time, whether it's structural, whether it's cultural, whether it's direct, right? Whether it's highly temporally resolved, whether it's highly spatially resolved, we have these trade-offs, and it's up to the responsibilities on us as an analyst or us as a researcher to know the appropriate data set, that they're the best data set to use for the job, and to know its limitations so that we're not making claims that the data don't bear out. So, given the need to understand the data you have so you can actually engage the right kind of conflict or violence for your project.
So, wanted to wrap up really quickly here. I know that we're running a little bit over our time. But one point that I just wanted to make to wrap it up is we zoom back out to this, broader understanding of these concepts and also specific databases and tools that we can use to start to make sense of what's happening on the ground is the second point, that violence and conflict do not only affect the implementation phase. In my experience working in development and with a lot of different projects, it's typically that phase that we're thinking about. But I also wanted to encourage everyone to really grapple with how conflict and violence affects the entire program management cycle. So in the design and planning phases, as well as monitoring and evaluation, you think about the cascading consequences of having conflict and violence situated differently in different spaces that affects the information that you receive, the reliability of that information, the safety of even bringing groups together to talk about what their needs are. It just, again, at different phases of the cycle, it might make sense to even conceptualize conflict or violence differently, depending on your different project goals and, again, what phase you are in the management cycle. So, I don't know if you wanted to
That's all we
wrap it
have.
up, but
Thanks, Any questions? Yeah, we are over a few minutes over time.
Thank you, guys. This is really important.
So
Yeah.
just to understand the background, when you're going back to Oregon, what you're gonna do with it? Are you framing this in a certain way, or you're just putting this in the PhD dissertation? Or?
What's that?
So the kind of findings from your presentation now, what you've been looking at in recent
These case
months,
studies?
exactly. Are you using them in the dissertation, and what's the broader context? Is there any particular point that you're wanting to make?
The book or ROM stuff has been published in OECD. We are expanding that into a peer-reviewed article, mainly adding in a lot of spatial statistics, and we also have 2 more years of data since this was published. And actually the trends are totally different now because we have a lot more resettlement. That wasn't so much happening at this time, so the relationships are different. This was just submitted for publication on refugees in conflict, and this, I don't know. This has just been a helpful thing to realize, I guess. It's something that Laura and I and other researchers in our sort of cluster of geography conflict people have grappled with and have tried to think about what a useful assessment is in comparing these data sets. The way that these data set comparisons have typically been done is you get 2 data sets that try to do the same thing, and then they say, well, which one's better?
Yeah.
And this is obviously a different point that we're making because it's getting at this bigger picture of how you conceptualize conflict and what's relevant for your study totally depends on, well, sometimes the choice of data defines how you can even conceptualize it, but of course that's kind of putting the cart before the horse. You want to go the other way. But it's really early days, right? Like we're only 20 years into even conceptualizing in a rigorous way forms of non-direct violence, and we're less than that in terms of systematic monitoring conflict databases. So the work with them over the last 2 months and the next month and a half or so is trying to build on this as well. And it's more directly addressing the limitations of this UNOSAT data set, which is satellite derived, but it's expensive commercial imagery. You have 6 highly skilled image interpreters in Geneva in like a locked tin shed, like looking at imagery for, you have 6 hours, give me a map of rocket today. That's unfortunately the way that things have been done for the last 30 years. Not always with such good imagery, but it's been done that a long time. What we're interested in is leveraging all the other data that we have available to us. And I also, just from a personal viewpoint, I don't want 6 people in Geneva deciding what to map. I want an open source algorithm. I want open data. I want people that have We get an internet connection. If you have an internet connection, you say, give me the most recent damage maps of my city, my neighborhood. And that's where we need to go with these data. And we're pretty far from it right now.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, all the power to you.